A complete stranger contacted me asking me if I could get their Stihl edger working better. Now, it's not often I'm handed a piece of equipment on this level, and not to mention in the condition that it's in, so I was very pleased to have this opportunity. Now, most consumers never read their owner's manual, and if they did, they'd know there's a critical piece of maintenance they might be forgetting to do. Hopefully the issue isn't too bad, otherwise this could be a very involved repair. In today's video, we look at this very new looking Stihl edger, and the issue is that it could run a little bit better. Now, for some reason, a lot of people don't realize that this particular engine is not a conventional two-stroke. Instead, this one has valves, and unfortunately, that means eventually they'll need to be inspected and more than likely adjusted. Now, I'm going to try and repair this edger, however, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We do not have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. The first thing I like to do is look around the machine I'm about to work on and look for anything that might be an issue or maybe even troubling. The one thing I will say is that Stihl likes to brand all their components to let you know that it's an original part, and that you should also expect a very high quality component as well. Now, I don't blame them for doing this because there are a lot of aftermarket components that are made to replace original ones, and they're about half the cost as well. Aside from missing an ID plate and a few scuffs, this edger is in really good condition for being several years old. More than likely it hasn't been used all that much, which sounds like a good thing, but more than likely it might also mean that they didn't keep up with the maintenance schedule either. The biggest issue I have on these 4MIX engines is that they want you to check the valve lash every 2 years, but this edger is over 8 years old, and from what I've been told, it's never been checked since new. Now, there is fuel in the tank, so I think we should start this edger and see how it's running. Now, to be honest, I think it sounds fantastic, and I don't see what the issue might be besides needing an idle adjustment. However, they're the ones who are using it, so they would know best when it comes to the way their equipment is running. Either way, we still need to check the valve lash and adjust them accordingly. Now, to get to the valves, we need to get to the valve cover, and that's underneath the engine cover. I'm also going to remove the air filter cover to inspect the filter, just in case it's wet with fuel or really dirty. And surprisingly, the filter is not wet or dirty, which means there was some basic maintenance being done on this edger. I'm also going to pour out the fuel that's in the tank so I can inspect its condition. What I'm looking for is whether it has any moisture in it or if the color or smell is off. However, after inspecting it, I don't see any moisture in it, nor does it smell stale. It just smells like gasoline. Now, the color of the mixture of gasoline and two-stroke oil is a bit heavy for my liking, but I don't think it's enough to make a big difference on how the way the engine runs. While the cover is off, I'm going to also check the spark arrestor screen in the muffler. Now, this screen has a tendency to clog up with carbon over time depending upon how you use the engine, but as you can see, the screen is not clogged, so it's not causing any issues with this engine. If your engine is down on power or it won't rev up like it used to, then I would check the screen for a clog. Now, since this one is fine, I'm going to reinstall it back into the muffler. The next thing I'm going to do is turn the engine by hand until one of the rocker arms is in its lowest position. That way I can check the valve clearance on the other valve. Now, the owner's manual would have you put the piston on top dead center, but this way is much easier to do. So the exhaust rocker arm is tight and in the down position. That means the intake rocker arm is somewhat loose, and I can now check the clearance between the arm and the top of the valve. What I have here is a sliver of a 4/1000th of an inch shim, which is what the clearance is supposed to be. All I'm going to do is slide the shim between the rocker arm and the valve stem to see how loose or tight it is. The problem is that the shim will not fit between them, which means the clearance here is less than the thickness of the shim and will need to be adjusted. However, if the shim did fit and was very loose, it would still need to be adjusted to make the clearance even smaller. The next thing I'm going to do is loosen the adjusting nut on top of the rocker arm. This will allow us to put the shim between it and the valve. Then I'm going to make small clockwise turns to tighten the clearance until the shim is dragging between the arm and the valve. After each adjustment, move the shim around to see how much drag is on it. Go slow and eventually you'll feel that there's more friction on the shim. Once the clearance has been set on the intake valve, we'll then turn the engine using the same method, but this time the intake rocker arm will be in the down position. The next thing I'm going to do is check the clearance for the exhaust valve, and sure enough, it too is tighter than the shim, so we'll need to loosen the adjuster and do the same thing as before. However, I do want to show you how I normally do this job, which is to remove the spark plug and then use a screwdriver inside the spark plug opening to find when the piston is at the top of its stroke, and then check the clearance for both valves at the same time. I'll then slide the shim into place and then start making small turns to adjust the clearance until I feel a lot of friction on the shim while moving it around. If you turn it too much, the shim will get stuck, and then you'll have to loosen the adjusting nut again and start over. Once I'm satisfied with the clearance, I'll then put the valve cover back on along with the spark plug. Now, I didn't explain why the clearance is so important, so I guess I'll do that now. The reason it's important is that the clearance allows room for the components in the valve train to expand when at running temperature. If these clearances are too much or too little, it could affect how these components work and affect how the engine starts and runs. Now, I did read some of the comments from previous videos that were basically saying how the valve clearance is overrated as a reason for starting and running issues, and I happen to disagree with those comments. I will admit that being a couple of thousandths off from tolerance isn't going to keep the engine from starting, but I do believe it does have an effect on how well the engine starts and runs. Now, some people might disagree with me, but I'm going to reuse the fuel that came out of the tank because I feel as though there was nothing wrong with it. If you feel as though there might be something wrong with the fuel in your tank, pour it out, get some fresh gasoline, and then mix a fresh batch of fuel and see if that makes a difference. When we get it started, we might have to make a few adjustments. This opening is for a Phillips head screwdriver and it'll adjust the idle speed for the engine. Now this opening is for the H screw and it's for adjusting fuel after fully squeezing the trigger, and the other opening is the L screw and it's for adjusting fuel at idle speed and when squeezing the trigger. Now, I'm not sure which tool this carb needs, but I find that both the double D as well as the hexagon tool work to turn them. If you need either one of these tools, there should be a link in the description. Now, the engine is still hot from our previous run, so I'm not going to be using the choke this time. Now, even though the engine was still hot, it started easily enough and it seems to rev a lot smoother than before the adjustment. Now, I did let the engine cool down and tested a cold start, which I did not film, but it started just fine with no adverse effects from the valve adjustment. Another reason why this engine would have running issues is a carb that's out of adjustment. Now, this happens when the internal components like the metering diaphragm or pumping diaphragm don't work as well as they're supposed to. The fix is to either rebuild the carb or replace it. So in the end, the valves were out of tolerance and much tighter than they were supposed to be, causing it to not run the way it's supposed to. But after the adjustment, we should be good for another 2 years until we have to check them again. So my question is, would a 2-year valve adjustment schedule be enough to turn you away from this particular Stihl engine? Personally, for me, the answer would be no, and the reason is that even with the clearance being out of tolerance, this edger still starts and works really well almost a decade after its purchase. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.